Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to get your gardening week started. And let's do that by spending about 90 minutes talking about gardening, answering your questions, and trying to focus today on your soil and what you can do in springtime to get your soil ready for your plants and get your garden ready for the rest of the season. I think it all begins with soil, or at least it should. It, especially if you're a new gardener and you're trying to figure out all this gardening stuff, or if you're a more experienced gardener and you're trying to figure out what's going wrong with all of your gardening stuff, so much of it can be tied back to your soil that if you start there, you can often figure out what the problem was. And sometimes it's not even a problem at all because you recognize that your soil is good. That's a nice baseline. Then you can figure out what went wrong or what went well because you know you started with good soil. So that's one of the things I want to focus on today. A nice shout out, of course, to Scotland today. We have our favorite folks, Eli and Kate from In the Garden with Eli and Kate, already on. And Quiet Space Arts from Orkney in Scotland is joining us today. So fantastic. And of course, our wonderful moderators, Heidi and Jay, are with us. So it's going to be a great time. I'm happy and excited because it's warm outside here in Colorado. We've had so much cold and snow for so long, and this week we are set to break records for how hot it's going to be. Last week, seriously, snow on the ground. Had posted a picture on Facebook with the ice, and I've got a video recently. You can see the snow on the greenhouse in the background. And this week, we're going to get into 80s, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We're talking 27 degrees Celsius. And I'm just ecstatic because there's going to be so much that's accomplished in my garden this week. And of course, I'm going to wear myself out just in time for this weekend when more snow is forecast to come. So that's Colorado. Record-setting heat in the middle of the week and then snow and cold on the weekends. But one day, hopefully, I'm going to get out of those freezing conditions about a month from now, and my garden will have the plants growing. And then, of course, you all will see that in the videos that will be coming your way. I'm trying to actually increase the number of videos I'm going to be producing over the course of the next couple of weeks because I just got so much I want to present and I'm running out of time. And so this week and next week and the week after that, I'm actually planning on doing 3 videos each week. And so part of it, I think, is just the spring fever. I'm so excited and so happy to be able to get out and do things that involves videos for me, and I've got to give them out to you. So I'm excited. Go ahead and share with me your excitement for the springtime as we move forward. One of the things that you'll be seeing, it's one of my extra videos that I'm doing this week, is on soil, because I am a huge advocate, as most of you know, in adding organic matter to my soil. And I've been doing that for years. And invariably, if someone asks me a question about what they can do to improve their soil, the answer is going to be add organic matter to it. And that could be in the form of compost, it can be aged manure, it can be dried grass clippings, it can be crushed leaves. I like using material that you don't have to spend money on and that you might have in your landscape, in your yard, to add to your soil. And over time, that benefits the soil. Well, the reason I say I'm excited now as I'm talking about soil is I did something recently, and that's what this video will be about. I did a soil test in my garden bed. And I always advocate, again, that you get a baseline for your native soil, your yard. You should take samples and know what kind of native soil you have, what the pH is, what the basic nutrient levels are. And that way, when you either plant in that soil or add that soil to your containers or raised beds, you have an understanding of what you're working with. I know that adding organic matter to your native soil is a good way to improve it. And that's been my approach for many, many years of gardening. And I know that my plants get better each year as a result of that. And I've talked about that in recent months with my peppers last year. Best pepper crop I ever had. And I think it was because primarily I had spent 3 years of dedicated effort to improve the soil in that bed in particular. And so I see it work, but when you just see something happen, it's anecdotal evidence, and I really wanted more scientific proof. So I took samples from one bed in particular that I highlight in this video and sent it in for testing. And the results came back just more amazing than I could have ever hoped for. The nutrient levels in that one bed that I did nothing more than just add organic matter to over the course of 3 years now actually is posing a bit of a quandary for me this year. I want to amend my soil on a regular basis, but what happens when you reach the point that you don't need to amend anymore? And that's kind of where I'm at in some of these garden beds that I'm testing. The nutrient levels are so good, I really don't have to add any more organic matter. It's okay for this season. So that's one thing that I wanted to start with today when you start talking about what to do with your soil in spring. Well, if you've done all the prep in autumn, and if it's over the course of a number of years that you're doing this on a regular basis, come springtime, you may not need to do anything to your soil because it's all ready to go. And that's why I'm excited, because I've just saved myself some extra effort. All my other beds are amended, they're mulched, they're ready to go. And I was just waiting for this one bed so that I can film it and share the story of that bed with you. And now it's like I had time set aside to work on the soil for this bed, and I don't have to. So I can devote that attention to other areas of my garden. Now, if you weren't lucky enough to have a couple years of good soil development, and if you didn't amend your soil last fall, now we get to the crux of today's show. How do you improve your soil in the spring to get it ready for the plants that you're going to grow? So let's go ahead and go to a question from Sandy, because this kind of plays into it. Should I add organic matter to heavy clay soil? Will that make the soil more heavy? Is sand better? No. Well, yes and no. Yes, you should add organic matter to heavy clay soil. It will not make it heavier. Sand can actually make it heavier. If you think about, I did a video where I talk about this, I think I did it a couple years ago, and I talk about if you have a clay soil and you add sand to it, you are essentially making bricks. That's how bricks have been made for millennia, and that's how concrete is made now, is they add sand and it creates this bonding of the larger particles and the small particles of clay. So those small clay particles fit in between the larger sand particles, and what you're left with is just a block that really isn't suitable for most planting. Whereas if you add organic matter to the heavy clay soil, you are taking those small particle sizes that the clay is very small particle size soil, and you're expanding those particle sizes and inserting all this organic matter in between. And that organic matter has a lot of pockets of air and pockets where water can move into. And so organic matter is the best way to improve a heavy clay soil. It adds air to it through those little air pockets, and it allows the water that would normally be retained by those clay particles to move into those organic particles as well. So a clay soil will be less soggy if you put organic matter into it. It won't have that consistency of wet clay. and the plants can grow better in it because you're creating all of these roots or all these options for the roots to grow and absorb that moisture and that oxygen. So don't use sand as a fix for clay. Use organic matter for a fix for clay. And it works the same with sandy soil. If you have a sandy soil, the answer is the same. You add organic matter. And it's never the wrong time to do that. And of course, I have to quantify that statement with more information. Trying to plant in soil that's too sandy or soil that has too much clay is going to mean your plants aren't going to do as well as they could. And plants that are stressed and plants that are struggling are more susceptible to pests and disease. So you want as sturdy and strong a plant as possible. So in springtime, if you're ready to start planting and you haven't done anything to your soil, go ahead and add that organic matter because it will improve the structure of the soil. It improves the overall tilth, which is basically the health of your soil that includes not only the structure, but also the nutrients that you have in your soil. Great idea. Anytime, if you've got the material and you've got the time, amend your soil. Where it can become an issue and why I like to do it in fall is that the process of decomposition of that organic matter will require nitrogen. The bacteria that break down that organic matter uses nitrogen as part of that decomposition process. So in a soil that is going through that organic decomposition, and that decomposition is what's releasing nutrients into the soil as well. Well, initially, there is a reduction in the nitrogen that is made available to plants because plants need nitrogen as well too. And so it's a battle between the plants and between the decomposing organic matter for whatever nitrogen is available in your soil. And most of our soils are deficient in nitrogen. So in the fall, I throw a bunch of organic matter into my soil, let it sit over the course of fall and winter and early spring. And by the time it is planting season, and that's what I just did the test on to see now's planting season is getting close for me and what are my nutrients level. Over that time, the nutrients have been released from that organic matter and are available for plants. But that does take time. So I don't use much fertilizer in my garden, but springtime in a newly amended bed is one of those cases where I use fertilizer. And I'm using a higher nitrogen fertilizer, mixing it into the soil. I'm feeding my soil. I'm not feeding the plants. I'm not pouring a synthetic fertilizer on top of the plants. I'm adding slow release organic fertilizers to my soil so that when the plant is battling the decomposition for the nitrogen that's in that soil, I have provided extra nitrogen so that it can be a balance. The plants will have enough nitrogen to grow, and that organic matter will have enough nitrogen to decompose. And that's the big difference between amending your beds in spring and amending your beds in fall. You can do it year after year like I've been doing and not use any fertilizers and get your soil to the point that it is packed with nutrients and never rely on a fertilizer. Or you can hasten the process and kind of give it a helping hand and add the fertilizers to the soil as part of it. So whether it's clay soil or sandy soil, add that organic matter, but be aware that in the spring you may also want to add some of the fertilizers, particularly the nitrogen, to get that whole process working. So Quiet Space Art says, I'm in zone 9B. How do I protect my big plant pots of potatoes from earwigs? And so earwigs are one of those insects that are primarily feeding on decaying material. And so there's a couple ways you can approach this. The earwigs, if it's just a couple of them, I just let them go because they're playing an active role in the garden, helping to break down some of that organic matter. That's their job. If they have created a nest in your containers, or if they're really overwhelming, you need to take away their food source, their primary food source. And so that may mean if you have mulched your potato containers, remove that mulch, let the surface dry out, and they'll find another home. You can also try lightening the amount. Instead of having like a thick layer of mulch, have a lighter level of mulch. Again, if you let it dry out, they like to have the moist food. Most of us eat moist food better, insects in particular. And so if you can allow the surface to dry out, they're going to go someplace else for food. And so that brings in the second approach when you're trying to get rid of a pest like earwigs. They're wanting to go to a place that's moist and that has a food source. And so they're going to leave your containers where you've taken away that mulch, or you've tried to remove some of that decomposing organic matter on the surface in a moist environment, and you set traps. And there are a couple different options. Some of the ways that you can trap slugs and snails will also work for earwigs. Not necessarily burying the container of beer, but putting carpet or wet cardboard near those containers. The earwigs are probably going to go to those wet areas overnight because they like the moist, and they'll also like the decomposing cardboard. And so I had a garden a number of years ago, and I didn't even know I was doing it. I was way new to gardening in those days, but I had a piece of cardboard that happened to be in the garden for whatever reason, and I picked it up in the morning, and it was loaded underneath with earwigs because they wanted that nice moist environment overnight. So you can think about it in two different ways: removing the reason they're in your potato containers to start with, and then giving them an option, and that option is a trap. And if you've got a whole bunch of earwigs in a rolled up newspaper, wet newspaper, or underneath cardboard, now you can pick them up, toss them out, and that should lessen your problem. So that's the approach I take. Sure, there are some chemicals you can spray, and I'm just not a big fan of introducing chemicals in the garden if I can avoid it. But most pests work that way. If you can take away their food source and give them an option that you are putting there as a trap, you can handle a lot of different pests in your garden that might work out. In the Garden with Eli and Kate says, upturned paper cups filled with damp newspaper balanced on a cane. And yeah, that's the same idea. You're giving them that damp environment, and newspaper, like cardboard, is wood-based, so it's going to be a food source. So thank you for that, Eli, because that's the same basic idea. There's a number of different types of traps that you can do to get rid of them. And what's in the garden is saying, so the earwigs around my magnolia are loving the fallen flower petals. Yeah, and it probably lots of other food options as well, but that's what happens when flower petals fall off of the plants, and then you come back a couple weeks later and there's no sign of those petals. That's because of all that life that's eating them and breaking them down for improving the soil. That's why I don't really like to get rid of my ants or my earwigs or my beetles, all those kind of insects that some people are annoyed by. They're breaking down that surface material to then improve the soil, because that's falling down into the soil and improving it over time. So I like to work with those insects as much as possible, and something as simple as a flower petal is probably an all-day lunch for a few earwigs. So let them go to it if it's something that really isn't annoying you. Deb the Corgi Mom in Colorado Springs 5B. I'd like to plant out my cabbage, beets, and lettuce, my raised garden bed on a retaining wall. I have hoops and frost cover for them. Will they survive? Probably. And so I'm in Colorado Springs Zone 5B as well, and April is the time that I'm usually starting to put out those plants with hoops and plastic as the protection. And so as long as you are planning to do that, then yes, they should work. The key is that you're going to need that protection because we still have some cold days ahead. I looked at our long range forecast and it actually looks pretty good. And so I think the coldest that we're supposed to have next week is going to be somewhere around 27 degrees. That's about -3 Celsius. And with a cover, those kind of plants, the beets and the cabbage and the lettuce, should be able to survive. They can all handle temperatures below freezing. And so a plastic cover over hoop will give you about 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of extra protection. If our temperatures start dropping much below that, then you might need to add a second layer of protection to avoid any critical damage. For most plants, if the temperature drops below 28 degrees, that's about -2 Celsius, you can start getting some cellular damage. That's a hard freeze. And so if you can keep the temperature around the plants warmer than that at night, and a plastic cover is a great way, then they should survive. And so surviving is a relative term because they're not necessarily going to die, but the leaves can be damaged and the plant will suffer and it'll take some time to recover. So I'm typically not planting, and I start from seed, same idea. I start from seed and then cover with the plastic to keep those seeds nice and warm for germination. But we're pretty close. I usually start the 3rd week of April, sometimes the 4th week of April for those cool season plants. And we're there. So I'd say go for it, Deb. And just be ready that with all this heat we're having this week, you know that more cold is coming. And it's the cold that you really have to be most concerned about when we start getting into those kind of issues. And so that ties in with the topic today is it's soil in spring as far as preparing the soil. Think in terms of not only the nutrition that your soil has, the amount of organic matter that you're putting into it and or the fertilizers that you're putting into it, but now also start thinking about the temperature of your soil as well. Because if you're growing from seed, and most of our vegetable plants can be grown from seed successfully in just about any garden, if the soil temperature is appropriate for that plant. Now, those of us that live in really cold regions have really cold soil. I showed that actually, I think it's in a video that I haven't shown yet, where I measured my soil temperature. And my soil, even though we've had some warm days, my soil is still less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 4.5 degrees Celsius. And that's too cold for most of the plants that we're going to grow. I really like to have, even for the beets and the cabbage and the lettuce, those plants that can handle cold temperatures. They'll also germinate in cold temperatures. But when the soil temperature is cold, it takes longer for them to germinate, which means now those seeds are more susceptible to rot and to birds and to any other pest that's looking for a seed meal. You want your seeds germinating as quickly as possible. The solution is warming your soil. And so if you can warm your soil up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, you're going to save yourself many days of germination on those plants with just that little bit of a temperature range. And if you can improve your soil temperature up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 15.5 Celsius, then it happens even faster. And so that was a great question, Deb, because it leads into this nicely. So what I start doing at this time of year, I'm looking at the 3rd week, maybe the 4th week of April for me to start putting in some of those seeds. Well, a week before that, I'm covering that bed with plastic so that I'm warming up the soil. I'm creating a little mini greenhouse in that bed so that a week later, when it comes time to put the seeds in the ground, the soil has increased usually quite dramatically. And now my germination is going to be much faster. and usually much more successful because the seeds like that warmer soil condition. And so preparing your soil for spring includes much more than the nutrient level. There's that temperature aspect to it. And I like the hoops in the plastic. That's one of my favorite things. I've got, like you see in the picture behind me, this is my garden last year. I have hoops on my garden beds, most of the beds throughout the season, because it can serve multiple purposes. This early springtime, it's covered with plastic to warm up the soil and prepare everything. I am a huge advocate of mulch. You've heard me say that before. Well, mulch tends to moderate the soil temperatures. And so if you leave your mulch on your beds as it's approaching planting time, that mulch is going to help hold in the cool soil temperatures. So as you're looking to increase your soil temperature, go ahead and rake aside the mulch. Go ahead and expose that soil to the sun so that it can warm up, and that'll gain you some extra time too. So definitely put the mulch back as the plants are growing, but think in terms of what you can do to get an earlier start on your season by monitoring the soil temperature and taking some of those actions to increase the soil temperature. And especially for those of us with short seasons, just that extra couple days on the front side of when our plants are going to be started can make a big difference with the success at the end of the season. And so it's work, it's effort for some of us who've been doing it for a while, and share with me if these are the kind of things that you do on a regular basis as well. This is just a normal seasonal activity in the garden. Covering the beds with plastic, raking aside the mulch. I encourage that you get a thermometer to check it. I use my compost thermometer to also check my soil temperatures, but you can also just use a meat probe from your kitchen to monitor your soil temperatures. And then you can take that extra step as well of knowing what germination temperatures work best for which seeds, and strive to get to that point. Try to get to the temperature where you'll have the most success. Last year, I didn't put my pepper plants in the ground until the middle of June because I was looking for the soil temperature to increase to benefit those plants. It just stayed too cold for too long. And so if you put tomatoes and peppers and eggplants into soil that's only 60 degrees or 15.5 Celsius, you're going to stunt those plants. They're going to be stressed. That's just too cold for them. You really want it to be at least 70 Fahrenheit, 21 Celsius. And for every degree you can get above that, you're going to have more successful plants. So as you're thinking about your springtime soil, test it. Put a thermometer in it, and that can really make a difference. I love the calendar. I love putting on the calendar the dates that I'm planning to start my seeds and to transplant. But on the day of planting, I'm out there with my thermometer. And if the soil isn't warm enough, then I don't plant that day. Even though I've been doing my planning, I've talked about this in my videos, I'll be planning in January and February the dates that I'll be planting in May and June. Well, they're not hard dates. This is your calendar. This is your garden. You can modify it however you want. If it comes time to put those seeds and plants in the ground and it's just too cold, then don't put them in the ground. Delay it for another day or two. With plastic over those beds, that does allow you to stay on track a little bit better, because even if it is too cold outside, chances are the soil in that protected bed is going to be warmer. So do be aware. Urban Chicken Mama is saying, what about the beds with onions, garlic, peas? Should I also remove the mulch over them? And so that's a good question. And so the beds that have plants that are actively growing and that are mulched, most of those plants will emerge or send up new sprouts or start growing again once the temperature is whatever's been logged into the database inside that plant. And so, for instance, my garlic, I plant my garlic in fall, I mulch it well, I keep it mulched, and I keep that mulch in place in spring. And then, even though that soil is warming at a slower rate compared to the other beds that I've moved aside the mulch, no problem. That garlic is going to emerge when the soil temperature is appropriate. The mulch is already in place. I'm more concerned about the moisture levels in those beds so they don't dry out, and that's a big reason for the mulch. I'm not looking for a quick, fast growth of garlic. I'm okay with it just happening. And so alliums, the onions as well, fall into that same category. And as for peas, and peas is a good example. So the plants that have a bigger seed and send up a sturdier seedling, when I put my peas in the ground, I mulch. Now it'll be a light mulch, but that pea plant is strong enough to push up through whatever mulch I have in place. So early in the season, if I'm starting from seed, like with the peas, I'll warm up the soil, but then I'll put the peas in, I'll do some dried grass as a light mulch, and that plant will pop right through it. Other plants like carrots, for instance, that have a much more thin and delicate seedling, I'll wait until those plants are actively growing before I mulch, because that plant may not be strong enough to push up through whatever mulch I put on it. But the onions and the garlic, just like the peas, nice big sturdy plant, it's going to poke right through that mulch without any problem. So I leave my mulch in place for my garlic. I've got a small patch of some onions that I let overwinter in a bed, and same thing. I've cleared out the mulch in the rest of that bed, but I left the mulch in place where those onions happen to be. And so it depends on the plant, and it depends on whether they have been overwintered or whether you're starting them from seed is the way I approach it. So nice to see so many of the regulars checking back in again. I always like to give a shout out to Yankee Sista Homestead, and so many people. I'm trying to scroll down to make sure I catch up with everything. And I will ask Thelma to send me an email to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. I have a question I want to ask you, if you could do that. Llama's wondering, why do some seedlings germinate but have no leaves? And so that's an interesting question. So the cotyledon leaves, those very first leaves that will emerge from a seedling, are basically inside the seed. All of that structure of that seedling is present in the seed. And so when it pops up, the stem starts growing, those first leaves pop out, they start sucking up the sun's rays, and that generates the new growth for all the rest of the leaves and the stem and the full plant that you're looking forward to. And so I think there's a couple different reasons that this could possibly happen. So if as the seedling is emerging from the ground, something disrupts those cotyledon leaves, then they're not going to be on the plant. It's also possible that there's a pest as the seedling is emerging that will munch on that new growth. And so the stem tends to be a little sturdier, and now it pops up. I have a tomato plant that I just had in my grow area that this happened to. And I was trying to figure out, why did that one plant just pop up and not have any of the leaves on it? And there's nothing you can do at that point, because those leaves are really needed to get the energy for the rest of the plant. I've never seen a 1 inch tall seedling with no cotyledon leaves ever survive and grow into a full plant. And so I think in my case, it was an overwatering situation. And I think it was in one of the cups that I'm experimenting with, and I'm trying to figure out different water levels. And I think the soil was just so saturated that it led to some fungal problems, and the plant was just too weak. And so as it emerged, it's not the same as rot, but it's the same idea. Those leaves were just on a stressed plant, and they fell off as soon as it emerged from the soil. So there's a couple ideas. It's hard to say what exactly the cause is, because it could be a number of things, but hopefully it's just a random occurrence and something that doesn't happen all the time. But it's not like the plant genetically has no leaves. Something happened to those leaves as they were growing and as the seedling emerged from the soil. And that's really where the focus should be. What was it that caused those leaves to fall off? And is that a problem that can be fixed? And I think in my case, that's the only thing I could figure out. That one cup was clearly saturated, and the soil in the other cups weren't. And so that's why I'm thinking it basically was too wet, and that the plant just couldn't survive. So hope that helps out. That's one of those things that sometimes you have to do some investigative detective work to figure it out. James is wondering, have you ever tried sprinkling cinnamon on the soil around the plants? No pests of any kind so far this season, no fungus either. I'm a believer. I haven't. Well, I take it back. I have, but not on a regular basis. And so cinnamon does have some antifungal properties. And the idea is that you sprinkle the cinnamon on your surface of the seed starter mix or your potting soil. That helps cut down on the fungal growth that could lead to fungus gnats or to a disease like damping off. And there is some validity to that. There are some antifungal properties to cinnamon. I just look at that as kind of an expensive way. Cinnamon, you can find some big containers that are relatively inexpensive, but that's relatively an expensive way to deal with a problem that I think is easier to fix in other ways. And so I bottom water my seedlings, and I allow the soil surface to dry out, and that's usually enough to take care of fungus gnats. I don't have any fungus gnats at all this year, and I rarely have a damping off disease issue for the same reason. As soon as the seedlings emerge, I remove the humidity dome, I allow the surface to dry out, and that usually nips the problem in the bud. So if it is a recurring problem, if you live in a more humid environment, I have dry air, so my surface of the soil dries out very quickly, and that's why it works so well for me. But if you have a humid environment and you can't get the soil surface to dry out very well, then cinnamon could be an option. And like you, James, I've heard from many others that say it works. And I read one university paper that did say that the antifungal properties of cinnamon are true. But what that paper talked about was the efficacy, basically how long that works. And an old bottle of cinnamon is not going to work the same as a fresh bottle of cinnamon. So the life, or I should say the age of the cinnamon makes a difference if you're going to use it. And so if you want to do cinnamon to try to solve some of those issues you might have with your seedlings, do try to use the freshest cinnamon you can. And I forget, one of the cinnamons, like Madagascar cinnamon, was better than one of the other types of cinnamon. I don't remember what it is. If you did a search, you might be able to find that paper and take a look at it to compare different types of cinnamon and their antifungal effect, because it does make a difference which type you're using. Again, I didn't want to delve that deep into it and waste cinnamon that I could use in other things that I'm baking on my plants, because like you, my herb shelves have old seasonings and old herbs, and they're not as effective as they might have been when they were young. So a couple things to think about on that. Margaret Alice is saying, I've got cinnamon on all my chili plants overwintered, and it helps So I'm fortunate. It lessens problems, must bottom water, never from the top. Yeah. And that's the idea. And so it kind of works in conjunction with each other. The cinnamon is dry and you put it on a dry surface. And so, yes, the cinnamon helps, but also the dry surface helps as well. So you're right. The bottom watering definitely makes a difference. Okay. Yeah. And Ceylon, Joni's asking. Yeah, I can't remember which is better than the other, but it's just one of those things to be aware of. If you really want to delve into it, there's information out there that can give you some good information. And Ladies Garden and Home says had great results with the Ceylon cinnamon in a damp environment. So there you go. It's just, in that respect, I'm lucky that I live in a dry area because I haven't had to use those kind of things. And it's nice because anything that you don't have to do and still have good results is beneficial in our gardening world. And so we've talked about the nutrition of the soil. We've talked about the warmth of the soil, and we kind of touched on this a little bit with that first question where we were talking about clay soil and why the organic matter is important to introduce oxygen. You got to have air in your soil. Well, that's another thing to think about as you prepare your soil in the springtime. If you live in a region like Colorado where you get heavy snowfall, your soil is more than likely going to be compacted. And it's a concern, especially if you haven't done anything to your soil, if you haven't amended it, if you haven't turned it, if you haven't made an attempt to loosen it, then the compaction builds up over time. Now, I'm not suggesting getting out with a tiller and just ripping apart your soil. I'm not a big fan of tillers. You want to add air to your soil. So it might be with a broad fork if you're doing the gardening in the ground and you have a broad fork. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to get those prongs down into the soil, and you rock it and lift it and add air to the soil. I use my garden fork in my raised beds. Same idea. I stick it in the soil, jiggle it around a little bit, and try to loosen the soil that I know is compacted. If it's soil that you amended in the fall with a lot of organic matter, chances are that organic matter, it acts like shock absorbers to the possible compaction. So a soil that has a lot of organic matter in it is not going to compact as well because that organic matter absorbs the pressure of whatever it is that's compacting your soil. But if you haven't done that, or if you know your soil nutrients are good enough that you haven't put in the organic matter, you may still need to get that air into the soil. You need oxygen for those roots to grow. So think about that, whether it be a pitchfork, a garden fork, something to just try to loosen up your soil if you know it to be compacted. If it's not compacted, it's not that big an issue. And that really helps with the idea of encouraging soil organisms to your garden, because you can allow soil organisms to do that for you. That's a big reason why I don't try to get rid of my ants. My ants are aerating my compacted soil. And a lot of the larvae that might be growing, hopefully it's not a harmful larva, but things that are growing in the soil, they're aerating the soil in the process. Earthworms, of course, are famous for how well they can loosen compacted soil. All of those insects need food, so there needs to be some organic matter in the soil to start with. But let your soil life do some of the work for you. That's Charles Dowding's big idea with the no-dig gardening, is you keep adding layers of compost to the top. That's supplying the nutrients that the insects need, and then you just let nature do the aeration for you. Well, if you haven't built up the soil to have all of that soil life yet, you've got to get out there and mechanically break apart the soil and try to get some of that air and oxygen into it. And it can make a big difference. your plants will grow better in looser soil than they will in compacted soil. So think about that as another one of those spring tasks that you have to get out and do. We didn't have a lot of snow this year, not the heavy snow. And so I'm not really thinking about that as one of my garden tasks this year. But last year it was one of those garden tasks that I had to do, was get out and get my garden fork and loosen the soil in some of the beds as spring preparation. And then it leads to a robust plant growing season, and you'll be glad that you took that extra work. So Stephen is wondering, what organic material should I add to my soil? I'm a rookie gardener. So compost is at the top of my list. Compost is already partially broken down or fully broken down, depending on your source of compost. You add it to your soil, give it some time, at least 2 weeks. A month is a good minimum, and more than that is better. And so you add compost to your soil. So for instance, those of us that aren't going to be planting till the end of May or beginning of June, adding compost to your soil in April will give you enough time for the soil organisms to become happy with that new food and to start releasing some of those nutrients. With more time, I like to add dried grass clippings, shredded leaves, aged manure, anything that I can get for free or very low cost. Usually the cost is just transportation to go and get it. But anything that you might already have on your property, use it. And it's good. Crushed leaves, the dried grass clippings, the aged manure, all of that has not decomposed yet. And so that's why it's better to do those type of organic materials when there is more time for them to break down. But you can still do it 6 weeks before you put your seeds in the ground, with the consideration that you should probably add a nitrogen fertilizer to help with that decomposition. And so I think the best organic material to use is the material that you already have and can use it for free. You just need to incorporate it into your soil, ideally with enough time for it to break down. But that's why I say that good soil development takes years. This isn't a quick fix. So if you're new to gardening and you want to do something for your garden, do it now. You might not see dividends for 2 or 3 years in some cases when we're talking about this soil improvement, but this is the 4th year that I've been in this house. This will be my 3rd full year of gardening. And last year was better than the year before, and I anticipate this year to be better than last year, because each year my soil has gotten better because I continue to add all those things that I already have. And I like to mulch with straw. All those things I previously mentioned I use as a mulch on top of the soil. I also like to mulch with straw because straw is a relatively light material, and when I add the compost and everything else to those beds, if some of that mulch gets mixed into the soil, and a number of my beds, that's what I did in the falls. I just turned in some of that straw to add organic material to the soil. That straw will break down as well and become food for all of that soil life. So it's an entire process of just continually using the materials you have, incorporating them into the soil, letting the insects incorporate them into the soil and then decompose them. And the result is good soil. And springtime is a nice time to either get it started or continue the process so that you allow all that to happen. And Steve says, grubs in my soil. Grubs are the larvae of beetles, and beetles are a critical component in the breakdown of that organic matter. So whenever you see something, any pest in the garden, especially the grubs, try to identify what it is. There are keys, a guide for you to go through and identify that grub. And so you can find some of those insect keys online, and you're going to be looking at So a grub, most of us know the grub as a little fat white thing that is in our soil. They're going to have 6 legs. And if you look at the legs and the eyes and the separation of those legs and coloration on the top, you'd be surprised. You can, in most cases, easily identify what the adult will look like by just trying to find one of those online keys to figure out what kind of grub you've got in your soil. And you may find that it's one of those beneficial bugs that are going to be breaking down the soil and doing a good role in the garden, or you may find that it's one of those bad bugs and it's something that's going to eat your plants once it emerges from the soil. And so I don't automatically think that any of the grubs that I find are bad bugs. I do try to identify them. But if you've got a problem with pests and the kind of pests that are going to emerge from the soil and eat your plants, they're probably going to be grubs in your soil. And once you've identified that as a problem, anytime you see a grub, throw it to the chickens, throw it to the birds, throw it in your compost, whatever you choose to do. But those are the kind that, yes, you do need to remove them from the soil, which is probably what you were wondering. Greg's asking, have you ever had a raccoon dig up everything you fertilize with organic fertilizers? Anytime I add fish emulsion or bone blood meal to my garden, the animals destroy at night. So yes, I suspected it was a raccoon at a previous garden and didn't have clear signs of it. I've had my dogs do the same thing. That is one of those considerations. And another reason why I don't use fertilizers in my garden, because I've had them dug up by animals. And so if I can use a material like leaves or grass or manure or compost, chances are you're not going to have a raccoon or a dog dig up that bed. I like using blood meal. I like using bone meal as options for organic fertilizers, but I tend to use those more in my container gardening and in my potting mixes. And by the time they get out to the garden, there's not going to be enough of that left behind to pose too much of a risk. But if I can, just stay away from it, improve the soil over time. And since I've done that, I haven't had any issues. I know there are raccoons in my area. I haven't seen any sign of a raccoon digging up my garden. Now, I did at the Galileo School Garden, I did have a problem, and I think it was a joint venture between the raccoons and some other animals that I wasn't able to fully identify. But the grubs, we were just talking about grubs in the soil. I've had animals come to the garden and dig up beds to get to the grubs. And most of the time, those beds were pretty heavily mulched. And the grubs were right there in that layer between the mulch and the soil. And the animals would come and dig up those beds to get to the grubs. And I've had chickens do that as well. My neighbor's chickens escaped once and came and pulled aside all the mulch to get to the grubs that were in my bed. So yes, I have had some of those issues, and the solution is usually covering the bed with hoops and material strong enough to keep those animal pests out, or just try to stop using those foods that you're using as a fertilizer, but to the animal, it's a food, and maybe come up with an alternative that won't be so enticing. And I still have my blood meal and my bone meal bags, but I haven't done that since I got my dog Mala a year and a half ago or so, because she has so much fun digging up things around the garden. I didn't want to give her a reason to dig up my beds by putting blood meal in it, because my last lab, Lily, would do that. If I put blood meal in the garden, not so much bone meal, mostly the blood meal, she'd want to dig in that bed. So I'd have to put bird netting around that bed over the hoops to keep my own dogs out, because they were often the worst offenders of some of those issues I have. Vic Wick Gardens is saying, my dogs love the smell of my fertilizer. Someone suggested that my dogs aren't getting enough nutrients. I think the dogs are fine. It just smells really good to them. Oh, absolutely. Yes, exactly. I'm not worried about the nutrients of my dogs either. But if you throw a bone out to them, they're going to go get that bone regardless of whether they're well fed or not. And if you're sprinkling blood and bone on the ground, to them, it's just like you giving them a bone. It probably smells exactly the same, and it gives them something to do. So, in the garden with Eli and Kate, it's the female blackbirds who make the most mess at this time of year for us, digging up any space you can get into. Yeah, and so we were talking, or I was talking about the grubs in particular, but seeds, and I'm not sure what your blackbirds are eating, but it could be some of the seeds, be it from weeds or something you put in the ground. It could be those grubs. There's a lot of birds like that. We have grackles in this area that have a similar issue, and it's the barrier. It's putting up that bird netting, something to keep them out while your seedlings are growing. I haven't had a big problem with the birds trying to eat the seeds that I sow, but I'm also, especially this time of year, covering those beds with plastic. And so it's one of those things, maybe the reason I haven't seen it as a problem, because I'm doing exactly what I'm saying to do. I'm covering those beds and not allowing the birds access to them. So the blackbirds can be an issue. All of us have some type of pest bird that we can hopefully get rid of. And so let's see what Margaret's saying. I've had dogs time 3 and they were fine. So yeah, I love my dogs in the garden, and they're absolutely fun, and I've got good memories of all of the good times and bad times in the garden. So I say add dogs to your garden and just accept what happens. What's in the garden says rats will also go for those tasty fertilizers. Good point. I don't have a rat problem. I get asked questions about the rodents from time to time, and that's often one of the problems with using those kind of fertilizers as well. The rodents are going to come after them. So like I said, I've just learned to use alternatives and have had great success by taking the time over time to improve the soil, and it all tends to work out. Yeah, Gardens Happen says grackles are destructive, and I know it's just not me. Obviously, there's a lot of the rest of you that have those problems. So just be aware of that. Gardens Happen says rats digging in the compost can help turn it. I agree. I have mice in my compost pile, and I know that because I see them or hear them from time to time, or Mala will be rooting around that area and come back with a mouse. But I agree with you. It's one of those things that they'll turn the pile, and the birds as well. I let the birds have access to my compost pile as well, because I've had blackbirds and grackles in my compost pile trying to eat whatever's inside of it, and they're turning it for me. Yeah, it's less work for me if I can get something else to help aerate and move that pile around. So it could get to the point, I suppose. I've never had the whole flock come in and cause devastation. So you do have to be careful of how much it is an issue, but do be aware that it could be a problem. Dusty Flats says, Growfully with Jenna's dog ate her fish fertilizer, and voles could be attracted to bone meal. Yeah, I've told this story in the past. I was experimenting with the Three Sisters planting and trying to do what many of us in the U.S. learned in school at Thanksgiving time about the Native Americans helping the Pilgrims, planting their corn and bean seeds, and they used fish as fertilizer. And so this is a number of years ago, almost 20 years ago now. And I had a garden, and I was doing this as an experiment, and had a dog, and didn't really think it would be a problem. And I think it was probably at about day 4 or day 5. I think maybe a little bit after that, I think the plants were just starting to emerge, the corn. Corn can germinate pretty quickly if the conditions are good. And I came out and that whole garden area was dug up because that was my chocolate lab Shaka had discovered the fish. Apparently the fish I buried had just reached that point where it was breaking down, decomposing underground, starting to send up all those wonderful aromas that dogs love. And when I first put it in, it was buried and probably not emitting much in the way of a foul odor. But when it reached that point that my dog was like, oh, that smells pretty tasty, she dug up everything and uncovered those fish. So yes, it can happen with fish fertilizer, because it definitely happens with the fish that you bury in the ground. And again, just a tasty morsel for the dogs. I have used the fish fertilizer in the past, and I noticed Lily in particular wanted to get into those beds that I used the fish fertilizer. So I've just evolved into things where my dogs aren't tempted, and it's really not a big issue as far as that's concerned. So let's see, John is saying, have you known rabbits to dig deep holes in heavy clay? We have 2 rabbit-sized holes with very little to almost no dirt above ground. And so in my area, we've got rabbits, and our soil tends to be pretty dense, and it's more of a sandy loam, and the rabbits will dig into it. And so what I've seen, it's usually during nesting season, when the mama rabbit's trying to make a nest for the baby rabbits, and they'll dig into whatever they have. I have an area around my shed, which is where the rabbits have actually set up a home beneath the shed, and they'll dig through the gravel that I've got around the shed to get to a spot under the shed and also make a nest. So yeah, they can dig in clay, they can dig in sand, they'll dig in gravel. If there's an area that they find and want to make a nest in, the consistency of the soil isn't going to stop them. And my soil in some of those areas is really, really dense. I mean, I need a pick, and I need a metal bar to break apart that soil for me to dig a hole. And the rabbits are just doing it with their little claws. So they can definitely get into it if it's an area that they want to make their nest. And I think that's primarily what they're trying to do, is create a nest. I'm not sure why a rabbit would dig in an area that's hard to dig unless they had a reason like that to continue their digging. So let's see, Joni S. is saying, my first year gardening, I considered an experiment, determined not to be disappointed. Second year, I turned to YouTube and binge watched Master Gardeners, Cowboy Gardeners, and Homestead channels. There you go. Great idea. I love that idea of binge watching all kinds of different types of videos. And, you know, it's interesting I think it's interesting when we look at gardening on YouTube and where you can get some of your gardening information, because we all are gardening for a different reason. We all have our purpose for setting in our garden. And, you know, if you look at homesteaders, and I'll generalize here, most of what the homesteading channels are focusing on is growing food. You've got your garden for the purpose of growing food. You have other channels that are focused on more of a how-to garden, how to put a seed in the ground, some of the basic. And of course, I've got all those videos for the basic gardener. I like to think I'm also presenting, and this is really the intent of why I make videos, it's to make you a better gardener, to take someone who maybe is just starting or have some basic ideas, or someone even more experienced, and take you to the next level. That's the approach I take. And then, you know, you've got other channels where it's just someone on a journey and they're just showing you how they're doing it, often without even fully understanding what it is they're doing and why they're doing it, and then showing the results, whether it works or not. All of that, I think, is a great way to gather information, because it really doesn't matter the reason why people are making YouTube videos about gardening. I learned something, pretty much every video I watch from that person. How they're doing it, why they're doing it, where they're doing it, all of that is useful information. It may not work in my garden. It may not be something I ever think about again, or it might be something that actually influences me to change the way I'm doing it. Seek out every source you can. If you're using Gardener Scott videos as your only source of gardening information, I say thank you, but I say you're limited. You really need to get out and find other sources of information. If nothing else, so that you can see that many of us are doing it the same way. If I suggest and demonstrate a way of what works in my garden and you see somebody else do the same thing, and then you see a third person that's doing the same thing, well, it kind of validates that that might be something for you to consider in your garden. If I show something and suggest something and you go to another channel and it's completely different, well, now it should generate some discussion in your brain as to which one is the one that actually makes most sense for you and might be something to try. There are channels out there that are 180 degrees from mine. I've got some videos that I've made using, of course, good old university research, the research-based information. And there's some big channels out there that have essentially the same video, but they say the complete opposite. I know of one really big channel with one particular plant, and the plant prefers alkaline conditions. Well, that channel made a video that said, you want an acid soil for those plants. Will the plant grow? Sure, but it'll grow better in an alkaline soil than it will in an acid soil. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. If you see a video of two different sources and they're saying the opposite things, do that research. Become a gardening detective and find out which one is more accurate. And now you've become more knowledgeable and hopefully will have more success in your garden because you've been able to get that good information and use it to your benefit. So I like the idea of whether it's a cowboy gardener or a homestead gardener or an inexperienced gardener just doing a vlog, watch everything you can. I do pretty much every morning. I'm watching gardening videos from channels of all kinds of different levels with all kinds of different ideas. And it just is information added to my gardening toolkit that I might be able to use at some point in the future. Joni's saying, I love channels that show how to plant, progression through harvest, because the proof is in the pudding. Yeah, absolutely. Yankee Sister says, so true. Diversify your channel viewing. There are gems everywhere. Absolutely. And so I'll use Yankee Sister Homestead as a good example because I watch Thelma's videos. That's a good example of a gardener who is not afraid to share with the world what she's doing in her garden. And there are great lessons there. You know, I don't live in Connecticut. My garden is completely different, but I can look at that garden and get ideas for what I want to do in my garden. So definitely share it up. In the Garden with Eli and Kate says, I think cowboy gardener means something different to you than to us in the UK. I have no doubt. And the idea being that whether you're a cowboy or a cowboy and gardening, then it still could provide useful information. So thanks, Eli, for trying to keep me from saying something that might put me into trouble. Jillian saying, I want to focus on soil this season. What are the areas that I should focus learning about? Are there certain plants or natural ways to fertilize the soil that I should read up on? Yeah, so I've got a video where I actually do a review on teaming up with microbes. And I think in the description below, there's a link to my favorite books. And you can go to that and see Teaming with Microbes is a fantastic book. And so that is one of those things, and I'm sure a number of you will start adding your comments on this as well. When you start understanding the soil life, and Teaming with Microbes is an incredible book. There's actually 3 books in the series that explain about the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, the beetles, the earthworms, all of those play together as part of your soil life. And when you understand how that works, I think it really makes it easier. And so I would say if there's something you want to focus on that aspect of what good soil really means and why it's good soil. It's good soil because of the life in the soil. And so you need to understand what that life is and what it should be and what you can do to affect it. And then that plays into the idea of fertilizing. And that's why I don't fertilize my soil, because you don't need to fertilize your soil. If you have that soil life that's present, they're fertilizing for you. They're taking all of that organic matter and breaking it down into its elemental stages that the plants can then use for their growth. And we don't need to add anything to it. You don't see big trucks rolling through forests and the open grasslands and spraying fertilizer. Mother Nature does all of that as part of just the natural process. And so if you can replicate that in your garden, Mother Nature's natural process of food in the soil that soil organisms eat and then release nutrients for plants to grow, you'll have a much better understanding of how to improve your soil in the years ahead. So that one book is a great place to start. There's a number of other similar type of books out there that can give you certain information. And when it comes to like certain plants to fertilize the soil, that's where you get into cover crops and green manure. There are plants you can grow to benefit your soil. And in essence, they're fertilizing your soil as well. And you're letting the natural aspects of those plants add the nutrients to the soil. Because that's all fertilization is just adding nutrients. And so be it a plant or be it decomposing organic matter, yes, there are many, many things you can learn in that respect. Legumes are the most famous because they work with certain bacteria in the soil, and they can take nitrogen from the air, and then the plants, with the help of those bacteria, will take that nitrogen, and actually it's stored in little nodules on the roots of those legumes. And that's one way to add nitrogen to the soil, is by using that natural process. There's more to it than that, but ultimately it's that central idea that it's the life in the soil that makes all the difference. And then when you choose your plants, you can actually match your plants to what you're trying to do as far as soil improvement and making the whole process more beneficial. So go for it. Hey, there's Tony, Simplified Gardening just came on. And for those of you that don't know, Tony's book just released. And so I think that I haven't added it to my, I apologize for that, Tony, since it just came out, but I'll add that to my list of favorite books. And it's available on Amazon in the UK, in the US, and coincidentally, you might see Tony on this live stream here in the near future. So, I wonder when that might happen next week. We'll have to wait and see. So good to have you here today, Tony. Okay, let's see. Heather says, thank you. Always learn something from you. Have a great day. Well, thank you for that, Heather. You have a great day too. I'm planning on having a great day because it's going to be beautiful here, and I'm definitely going to be outside. The Happy Gardener says, Dr. Elaine does a lot of work in the food web. That one is a good one to check out if you're working on your cell health. Yeah. Dr. Elaine Ingham is a great source, and there's a lot of videos that they have with Dr. Elaine Ingham as either a guest or actually as part of their soil food web education. They've got videos. And you're exactly right. The idea behind the soil food web is that it's a web. Everything is interconnected, and you have something that feeds on something else, 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 and understanding that at the very bottom you might have a bacteria, and that bacteria is eaten by another type of soil organism that is eaten by another type of soil organism that's eaten by another type of soil organism. And as part of that entire process, every time something is eaten, the nutrients within that food source are released into the soil. And now that becomes food for the plants. And so that's why this whole web of life, that it's a jungle. The way you think of a jungle with all the animals eating each other, that's what's happening in the soil with all of these different microorganisms. And yeah, Dr. Elaine Ingham is a great source for information, understanding how that all works as well. Sean Skelton says, thank you for all your videos. You're very welcome. Last year's garden and this year's much improved indoor garden in Montana, entirely your design. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I mentioned, I've actually been on a couple podcasts of a couple different channels recently, and I'm almost always asked the question, pretty standard question on gardening podcasts, of my first gardening memories and where my first garden was. And my first garden was actually in Great Falls, Montana, before I knew anything about gardening. And so I have a great affinity for gardening in Montana. It's a tough region to grow and can be more difficult than an area in Colorado like I'm in. So I'm glad to see that I've been able to help you out, because Colorado and Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas, this whole region, Utah, Idaho, it can be very challenging in the Rocky Mountains. And I'm trying to show as much as I can what I'm doing and what's working and what's not, because it is benefiting. So thank you for sharing that. So let's see, Moon Dust is saying, where can I get a book on preservation and canning? And so, of course, Amazon is a great source, but the book that you can also find in most bookstores, the Ball Canning Company has great canning and preservation books. So the Ball Blue book, and that's because it's blue, is a smaller book, and that's kind of the first book that anyone that's serious about canning and preserving almost always will have the Ball Blue book in their library. I use the Ball Complete, I think it's Complete Book on Home Preserving and Canning. I think that's the name of it. And that might also be in my favorite book list, as a matter of fact. And so the Complete Book on Preserving and Canning, and no doubt Jay is looking it up, and we'll probably put a link to it here pretty soon. But those are the ones I would start with. There's recipes in there. They show the whole method of how to do it all, and it's a great resource. You can also go online here in the United States, and of course you can access it from anywhere, but the USDA has a home preservation website, and on that website is a lot of great information and recipes for doing all of the preserving that you want to do. So that's a good place to start, Moon Dust, with the Ball books, and then of course looking further like USDA home preservation, and then of course I've got some videos on preserving, and we'll be making more this year as well. And so there's some good videos. I do encourage, when you're getting into it, that's why I suggest the Ball and the USDA, is to not necessarily blindly follow a YouTube video. You should try to have a recommended video from a source like the Ball Canning Company or the USDA, because there are some home recipes out there that might not be entirely safe. And so anything that's published in any of the Ball books will have been tested and had laboratory analysis done. And you can be sure, particularly the pH. pH is one of the big things you really need to be concerned about when you're doing home canning. And that's why you need to follow a recipe, so that the pH will keep out the bad bacteria like the Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism. And so if the pH is not low enough, then you could be introducing botulism to your family, which is not a good thing. A lot of people have died over the years from that. Stick with a recipe from a book when you're just starting out, and that's a great way to keep yourself safe. Let's see. Yeah, Yankee Sister says, I love the ball canning books. Start there. Congrats on wanting to preserve your harvest. Well, thank you for that, Yankee Sister. Yeah, ball's the way to definitely do it. Wormulus is saying lactobacillus fermentation. Fermentation has become, fermentation and freeze drying are now my go-to methods of preserving. I love fermentation. My brother-in-law has started getting into fermentation and is also loving it. Just fell in love with the whole idea. And the lactobacillus bacteria is what creates the lactic acid. The lactic acid is what keeps the pH low enough to keep out things like Clostridium botulinum bacteria, and just adds an incredible flavor when you ferment your food. So you're right. Normally, and the key is following the recipe, making sure that your brine percentage is appropriate, the salt percentage, and it's normally 100% safe. If you follow a good recipe, it will almost always be safe. Somehow humans are batting as close as you can to 100% safe with that preservation method. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to think, I've fermented a lot of stuff. I love my video on beets, fermenting beets. It's one of my favorite videos as I was making it. It's a number of years old. I've got my video on fermenting zucchini. This year I'll be doing videos on fermenting garlic. I've got a video, I keep mentioning this, that I've made. It's not coming out for a couple of months, but I fermented my chili peppers last year. It's a wonderful method, and you're right, Wormless. It's safe, and it's tasty, and it is something to think about. And I preserved for years using drying as a primary method. I love making my jams and jellies, canning tomatoes and lots of other vegetables, doing pickling as using vinegar as a primary method of preserving. And the fermentation is just so easy if you are following the right recipe and using the right amount of salt, that I'm becoming lazier and lazier in my old age, and the fermenting is one of the laziest ways to preserve your harvest. And so that's why you'll be seeing more videos on that, because I will be doing more and more of that, because I'm taking the lazy approach to some of the preserving that I'm doing. Yeah, thanks, Jay. There's that video on how to ferment beets. I appreciate that. It's in the garden with Eli and Kate saying, toying with the idea of dehydrating to make teas. Oh, absolutely. I have jars in my pantry of my mint, and I've got a video on, that just flew out of my head, chamomile. I've got a video on doing exactly that. I take my chamomile flowers, or chamomile, as you might say in the UK, and I dry the flowers, and I show making tea, and actually making a cup of tea and drinking it in the video. Oh, it's fantastic. The chamomile or chamomile tea that you make from the flowers you grew yourself, incredible compared to what you might buy at the local tea shop. So, and it's so easy to do. Most of those, including the mint, I make mint tea with the mint leaves that I dehydrated that are sitting in a little glass jar that's in my pantry. So easy to do, and it's just air drying to make that happen. I've got a video on how to dry herbs, and in that video I show how I dry my mint, and I use that to make teas. So it's so easy, Eli. You got to do it. You guys would love it. It's so easy and it's so effective. And a lot of times we're growing things that are perfectly suited to make teas. I've actually been compiling a list of teas, both for enjoyment and for medicinal purposes. And I'm not sure if I'm going to do it at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. But the reason I've been compiling this list is to make a video on using the plants you already have in your garden and how you can make them into teas that you can use as part of your lifestyle, either to make it healthy, make you healthier, or just like the chamomile tea in the evening, sipping it. Oh, it really is fantastic when you grow it yourself. So go for it. Absolutely. So Marcia Davenport, thank you so much for that super chat. Should I add my homegrown vermiculture to my cold crops now, or should I wait until we are past the last frost date? You can do it now. One of the benefits of doing vermicomposting, and then for those of you that might not recognize the term, that's using earthworms to eat your kitchen scraps or whatever it is you're feeding them, and then you're using the castings, the worm manure in your garden or in your potting soil. I'm using a lot in my potting soil this year. One of the benefits to that is the bacteria that's in that environment, the bacteria that is in the earthworm gut that is now out into the soil. All of that is very beneficial. And that gets back to that whole soil life that we've been talking about. And I wait to put my worm castings until it's warmer, because I don't want to run the risk that the cold temperatures that are still in my future will kill that bacteria. I want that soil life to stay active, and I want the vermiculture to play a role in that. And so while you can do that, absolutely, the nutrients that are in the worm castings will still be available to all the plants. But if you still have cold days ahead, and I mean cold like freeze the soil cold, then you might want to wait. If you're past the point that your soil is going to be frozen and not yet reach your last frost date, then you're probably okay. That the soil is probably not going to be so cold that it will kill that beneficial bacteria. But it goes into the idea of amending your gardens in springtime. And if you've got enough of the castings to amend your soil, and you need to aerate your soil like we talked about, or you need to add a boost of nutrients to your soil because maybe you didn't do a fall amending, then absolutely use worm castings in the springtime. They're already mostly broken down. They're packed with nutrients. They're packed with that bacteria, and that's a wonderful addition to your garden soil in the springtime. Most of us just don't have enough worm castings to add as much as we would like to, but sure, do it. The cold crops, and if it's warm enough for your cold crops to be growing, then it should be warm enough for the vermicompost to play that beneficial role in the soil. So and this is one of those things, Marcia, that do an experiment with it. I think you can try one bed with and one bed without, or maybe one area with and one area without, and see if you notice a difference. I've noticed improvement in my potted plants when I use the vermicompost compared to when I don't. And so it's a wonderful little experiment that you can do to see if you want to continue with that kind of thing. And the vermicompost really can be a great option. I wanted to go ahead and give a shout out today to Yvonne Waters. And so I noticed a couple of the members have popped up, and let me see. I didn't see who it was. Also, so Jillian is, it says, a new member to the Gardener Scott channel, and Colorado Bird Nerd is a new member. Patty Barr gifted a membership. That's fantastic. And so we have the Gardener Scott community that you can become a member of the channel, and there's different perks at different levels. The perk that I think is just the most fantastic is our private Facebook page. And the amount of information that's flowing back and forth on that page is just incredible. It's not me doing all the talking or me doing all the answering. It's really this wonderful community that's helping each other out. And I wanted to give the shout out to Yvonne Waters on that page in particular, because as I said earlier, one of my goals with this channel is to make you a better gardener. I'm helping you on this journey. I'm throwing out lots of information and ideas and philosophy. And so when I can see someone visibly making that transition to really become a better gardener and try to help others become a better gardener, I just think it's fantastic. And so I noticed this last week on 2 different posts that someone had asked a question, and Yvonne not only answered that question, but took that next step, took it to another level, where she provided university research-based information. It was an answer to a basic gardening question that most of us would just answer. But Yvonne answered it with the scientific information, which just pays so many benefits. Not only the recipient of that information can now see that there is research on that question that was being asked, but also to identify that a gardener like Yvonne has recognized that there's research-based information to help answer questions. And then to take that step and provide it to another gardener, I just think that's fantastic. And others have done it. I just wanted to highlight Yvonne because I noticed it this week in particular that she did it twice. Provided links to that university research, and I love that. And I think it's one of those things that I hope you think about as well, that when you have a question, by all means ask me and ask other gardeners you know, but do try to take that next step to see if there's research about it, to see if there's a paper that's been written, to see what the extension office in your area, which is supported by your state university, has to say about it. And that really is taking your gardening to another level. And, you know, I'm a little sad in some respects because so much of what I do is intended for new gardeners and it's basic information. And I know, because I've had people tell me this, that when they were a new gardener, they were watching all the Gardener Scott videos. And then they got to that level where they were doing their own research and they were doing their own experimentation, and they kind of stopped watching some of the Gardener Scott videos on a regular basis. I'm okay with that. I'm okay if you all are not watching all of my videos. If your progression and your journey leads you in that direction, that you graduate from Gardener Scott, I love it. I'm so happy that you've been able to do that. So I hope I can retain you all forever because I'm planning on doing this all forever. But do feel like you can do it yourself, that you can absorb that knowledge, that you can find out where the answer is yourself. And then, and this is the part I love so much about what Yvonne did, and then share it with others. Share with others what you've been able to figure out, what you've been able to find. And when you become a gardening educator, oh, the world just opens up for you. And you may not think of yourself as a gardening educator when you answer a simple gardening question, but you are. And I think that's important as we move forward, at least those of us in our primary growing season. There are a lot of opportunities for us to share our information with others, and I hope you do that. Hey, guess what? I'll be back next week. I might have a special guest that I might have already hinted about, and we'll be doing more talking about gardening so that your gardening week is the best that it can possibly be. I'll see you then. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.